does Piper have a point? Do the woke Christians have a point? How should the righteous respond to the Trump phenomenon, to the election? And if it is a full-throated endorsement of Trump, defend yourself. I would be interested to ask John Piper if he would vote for Reagan over Carter. I'm certain that he did. I mean, come on. Everybody did. And so I'm sure that he did. And I would want to know, based on his recent article about why he can't, in his good conscience, vote for Donald Trump, how he justified that voting for Reagan.
Well, actually, this is a great point that I've brought up a lot with people. And I brought it up in 2016 when guys like us were crews. And I was one of the few that said, no, Trump's going to win from the beginning during the primary.
Right.
But back then, I was getting from guys like us how can we have this guy leading the Republican Party? He's such a playboy
crass,
or all this
right,
stuff. Yeah. And the point I'd always bring up was like, you realize on all of this culture stuff, Reagan was the first step. So how can you be gung-ho, like I'm a Reagan Republican? Because that's the types of people who would usually bring this up. I'm a Reagan Republican all the way. But Trump, no. No, if Reagan is the first step on all of it. He was the one who instituted no-fault divorce. He is the first president that ever was a divorcee, which was...
Divorced and remarried.
Right. Which the Christians, when it came to, like, if it was Carter versus somebody else, they would have criticized the other candidate for having had a divorce.
Right.
The Overton window was that far to the right back then, culturally speaking, that Reagan was the Trump of that era in that regard, morally speaking.
And he was not a churchgoer. He didn't make the overt references to Christianity the way that Trump does. He doesn't go to evangelical churches and let people pray over him and stuff.
He was from Hollywood. He's had part of that culture where the Weinsteins of the world live.
Yep.
So, I mean, that point, I think,
and
should
so
have been raised in 2016.
That's what I would have asked John Piper, because in John Piper's article, he's like, I can't vote for Biden because he has bad policies that literally kill human beings. I can't vote for Trump because I gotta use his term.
Can't vote for Trump because he
is sinfully, no, it was something like
boastfully arrogant or something like that.
No, it was boastful factiousness. It was his boastful factiousness. Factious means to divide. So he's arrogant, he boasts, and he divides people. Those sins of Trump are maybe not morally equivalent, you would say, but they are bad enough to where I can't get on board with them. And he went through all about how sin leads to death. The sin of pride leads to death. The sin of boastfulness leads to death.
That's actually a good point now, because now think about Reagan. I mean, is there anyone more pro-America, America's the best, boasting in the United States?
Well, and also, the problem is he's equivocating on the word death. Like, abortion means death quite literally. Like, you're killing people. Sin leads to death in a sowing and reaping sense. Yes, the drunkard will eventually kill himself with his drunkenness. A society that values pride and devalues humility will eventually have fighting, and that will eventually kill. Like, there's and then there's another sense in which there's eternal damnation. Like, there's a sin that sin leading to death. But to just say, oh well, sin leads to death. This side, of course, has abortion, and we can get into 1,000 other ways that their sin leads to death, where this side has boastfulness. And so I'd say, taking that argument, Jimmy Carter's born again. He's repented of his sins, and whatever sins are there, he's forgiven. So he's not sinning leading to death. Reagan is an unrepentant adulterer. No, I don't know, adulterer. Unless you consider divorce and remarriage adultery. I don't know if he committed adultery.
Many Christians at that time would have.
Right, exactly. And Piper would say that that's adultery. That's an important point. Piper still holds that view, as I do, that remarriage after divorce is adultery. So you have an unrepentant adulterer, a born-again Christian, you endorsed him. Right?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question.
There's only one reason why, and I don't think Piper sees it about himself.
What's the difference?
Yeah, what's the difference between Reagan and Trump?
It's an interesting question, but I mean, I do want to bring up that Beth Moore, whose Twitter account I follow a few woke Christians just to keep up on what they're saying, but she was like, "Oh, look how consistent he's being." But I think she
only went back to 1995. In 95, he was saying, "I would never vote for somebody who supports abortion. That's a bridge too far." And so he's saying the same thing now. He's like, George W. Bush wasn't boastfully factious, so I could endorse him. Maybe Mitt Romney's not boastfully factious, so I can endorse him. But Trump, boastfully factious. That's the same thing as abortion. Where I don't think it's boastful factious is such a stretch.
Well, it's hollow. It's hard to find
the term that he's looking for is rude. That's the word he's looking for. But when you say
boastful factiousness and rude,
he's arrogant. He boasts. Okay, and that's a bridge too far. What I think the actual issue is rudeness. And Piper's from Minnesota. People in Minnesota are polite. That's like a phrase. The Minnesota kindness. It's kind of the premise of the movie Fargo, where the guy is actually like plotting the kidnapping of his wife, but he's really polite. And Trump is rude. There's no getting around it. In New York, he's maybe just a little bit ruder than average. In Minnesota, he would be unbearable to have around. And I think rudeness is really the bridge too far. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, I think he's trying to smuggle more in with the factiousness claim.
Which is why he brings up if you've read the article, he brings up these Greek words like, see, in the New Testament it says factiousness, that's a sin, and see, the president's factious.
Which, yeah, it is really slimy to bring that into a criticism of a party leader, a leader of a faction.
Exactly. It'd be like calling a denominational leader factious, because he says, we believe in credo baptism, therefore we won't accept infant baptism in our denomination. It's like, if you think denominations themselves are factions, then
we're all factious.
Then we're all factious in that case. Just like, exactly. That's like, yes, Donald Trump is factious in that he draws divisions intentionally. Mm-hmm. He's like, but when Paul is rebuking factiousness in the local church, he's talking about people who are dividing individuals one from another. It'd be more equivalent to somebody who says, you're voting for Trump, well, we can't be friends. That's more what Paul was addressing. To be fair, which is not what Piper's saying there. He's saying, vote, do what your conscience declares. I'm doing what my conscience declares. But I think the issue is Donald Trump is embarrassingly rude. Joe Biden is not embarrassingly rude. Ronald Reagan was not embarrassingly rude.
True. There's a big difference between Reagan.
The main difference. Say, it's harming our witness. Well, embarrassingly rudeness can harm a witness, to a degree. But when you see it in those terms of the evil of this party and the rudeness of the leader of this party, it starts to be the moral equivalency starts to become obviously silly.
Right. Correct.
I think. And when you looked at the individual things that he points out, like, was he immoral in his personal life? Yes, as was Joe Biden. As president, he hasn't done anything morally speaking that disqualifies him, in my opinion, unless you include rudeness of speech morally disqualifying.
Or being divorced and remarried or something.
He hasn't done that since being president.
True.
So I guess just the question is, what does Piper have a point? Do the woke Christians have a point? How should the righteous respond to the Trump phenomenon, to the election? And if it is a full-throated endorsement of Trump, defend yourself. Like, why?
So you're asking me to defend full-throated endorsement of Trump. Well, I think I will defend full-throated endorsement of Trump. I mean, to take the easiest route to that is to say, to point out the false equivalence of the whole thing. okay, I'm supposed to not vote for this man because boastful factiousness.
He's rude, which I think is, when it comes down to it, is rudeness.
I think that's a fair statement of what's really bothering them, yes. They are embarrassed to have to defend him. And in the other case, you're murdering babies. And it's not even really the fair way to say it. It's you are protecting the institutionalized slaughter of babies.
Right.
And the last time
and it's really a moral question more than a legal one. And part of what Piper was saying in the article was the people defending Trump are just saying policies are all that matters. Personal character doesn't matter, which I think is a false accusation against his brethren. Like Michael Brown wrote a retort to Piper saying, no, I've expressed all of my reservations for Trump again, for why I don't full-throatedly endorse him, but I'm still going to endorse him. And so they're saying character does matter, but policies matter enough to where you have to still. Well,
I'm going to call BS even more than that, though, because the same people.
But my point. Let me finish that point on the moral. Though it's a moral question rather than a legal one. Is you are defending the institution. It's like we're not saying vote for Donald Trump in 2020 would mean fewer babies are aborted in 2021, right? It's saying this understanding of this institution, of abortion, of the government-funded abortion, of everything the Democratic Party supports, literal infanticide, partial birth abortion, ought not be tolerated. Right? We have to take a moral stand against that. That is something that is beyond the pale, right? And it's even if we lose, we have to lose saying that. You know, it's like why the Whig Party failed was because they equivocate. I don't know with the slavery issue. It's like it took the Republican Party finally becoming an abolitionist party for the conscience of the nation to be turned and say we have to go abolition. No more of this controlled spread. No more of this. You know. Whatever other policies the North had, preserve the Union at any cost. No, it had to be full abolition. And once that happened, it was like then all the dominoes fell to where you've had abolition. Where with the moral question of abortion, it's like we can't talk about it like taxation. Like, yeah, I want lower taxes rather than higher taxes.
But I want safe, legal, and rare versus. You know.
but to say, but the party that says this is a moral good. Abortion is health care. That is a bridge too far where nothing that Donald Trump says or does is a bridge too far.
I would say that's exactly correct. The idea that a party on its platform saying abortion is health care, anyone who pulls the lever for Biden is complicit.
Is complicit.
Is as complicit as a Southerner pulling the lever for a Democratic Party that calls Lincoln. Slavery an economic system or something or some.
I personally would never own a slave. You know, but this party that says that it's a valued economic system is more to my interest than the one that wants to abolish.
Lincoln was awful rude.
That's the point. If Lincoln had funny orange hair and was rude, and even said the occasional cuss word on the stage.
If he had 3 wives, if he did all manner of things that it'd be tough to find something for him to do that would make someone like John Piper say, you know what? I can't pull the lever for the abolitionist candidate.
That's a good question. That's another question I have for Piper. My 2 questions would be, did you endorse Reagan, the divorced and remarried non-believer, or at least non-churchgoer, over the overtly believing, born-again Jimmy Carter? Secondly, and if not, why does Reagan's sins that lead to death?
Why are they different?
How are they different outside of rudeness compared to Trump's? And then the other question would be, how rude would Lincoln have to be for you to sit back and say, Stephen Douglas,
go ahead and take it.
Go ahead and take it. You know, that would be the question. And that's like, and I think the reason why I think obviously the latter point would sting more the endorsement of Reagan, he could say, well, I did endorse Reagan, and I guess you're right, it was a mistake. He couldn't say that about Lincoln. Because evading the current cultural battle that needs to be fought is easiest to do hiding behind the previous culture battle that had to be fought. The South was defending the U.S. Constitution against the evil of the institution of slavery. They were saying Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were on our side, rather than facing the stark reality of where they were right then. It's no coincidence that Tim Keller and John Piper and Phil Vischer, the VeggieTales guy, jumped full-throatedly into the Black Lives Matter movement. Piper spoke at a Martin Luther King 50th anniversary event, called it a gospel conference. It's like, Martin Luther King didn't preach the gospel. He taught that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Like, why are you calling it a gospel conference? Not to take away what Martin Luther King did for civil rights. He's a civil rights hero. But you talk about an immoral man. He had multiple mistresses while married. And you full-throatedly endorse him to where you'll name a conference after him.
And call it the gospel. Right.
And call it a gospel conference. And so the point is, Martin Luther King was fighting the battle that was right then, at that time. And he was on the right side of it. And he's an important figure for that civil rights movement. And the issue today, we have America that spent 8 years cursing Israel and is now blessing Israel. And we're seeing the peace of Jerusalem to a slight degree, but more than we've seen in decades. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we're seeing a Supreme Court that very well could overturn Roe v. Wade within the next few years. Like, there is a fight to be had right now. And to say, wait a minute, we have to go back and fight the civil rights movement. You guys can't endorse Trump because he doesn't look like Martin Luther King. It's like, Trump, to call Trump a racist is to, number one, it's to lie. But what it's doing, I think it's just like the Southerner who would appeal to the Constitution to evade the question of, yes, George Washington had slaves, and that was evil of him, right? That's the question. Like, that's the issue right now. And are you willing to face that down right now? No, we have to go back and fight the last one. Right? I think that's really I think that is part of what's
I've
happened.
had that hunch for a while, and it was part of my theory of that both political parties basically have a tendency to do this. And the Republican Party, I think its lingering David French level Reaganism is part of its last time we won, this is what we were fighting for, and so let's just keep fighting for it.
Just keep being limited government, guys.
But the Democratic Party has that a foot deep. They're going to, if they can't find racism to fight, they will manufacture racism to fight.
Yep.
Even if their statistics all go 100% degrees the opposite direction.
They'll call Kanye West and 50 Cent, the rapper who just endorsed Trump, every manner of racial slur. It's like, are we the baddies? like we're talking about racism. But exactly, like the civil rights movement won. Like, racism it's not over. There's still people who believe we faked the moon landing, and there are still racists out there. But as a culturally relevant political force, racial, like segregationism, it's over.
Well, there's a new form of segregationism in the woke.
It's people who are so woke that they're kind of circling around to the other side. They'll still have racially segregated classrooms.
I don't think it's that far. I think right now the people who are advocating on college campuses to have safe places for black students are just pretty mainstream on college campus. And it'll probably
it's not exactly the same as the segregation of the
there's one difference. It's that it's equal.
As opposed to separate,
as opposed to a power structure where whites are on top and then it's separate but unequal. They think this one's really separate but equal.
Right. And so anyway, it's undoing past injustices.
Right, exactly. I think you're exactly right on that point. And it's not so much that they're still fighting the old. They're using an old fight as cover for cowardice in this one.
And I don't know if I'd use the word cowardice, but I think it could well be. It's definitely evading. It's like, yes, I'm going to stand with the guy who wants to build a wall on the southern border, even though you're going to call him racist against Mexicans. Why? Because he's right on the issue of the day.
The issue with cowardice would be, is their attempt to deflect from the current cultural fight that is over an explicit evil institution by relitigating the last one? Is that...
And some of them are actually... like Phil Vischer did a video talking about why abortion, Roe v. Wade's not that big of a deal. And if you're pro-life, it's still okay to vote for the other. He didn't say, if you're pro-life, it's still okay to vote for Joe Biden. But the implication that anybody watching it got was, if you're pro-life, it's still okay to vote for Joe Biden. And the fact that it's the
reason why I think it might have something to do with cowardice is because it seems like the real impetus behind to bring it back to John Piper was one of the things that he said was, it's really harming to the witness.
Right.
And it seems like while that there could be a real sense in which that's true, it could also very easily be cover for, I'm looked down upon because of this moral stance. Meaning, this moral stance does not bring me any cred with anyone. Like, if I'm taking a stand against abortion...
Those two are not that different. But the question is, if you full-throatedly endorse Donald Trump and it harms your witness, how much more is it harming your witness than the endorsement of George W. Bush was in 2004? Because, we're both old enough to remember the burning of Bush effigies on the campus at UCF where we went, and how vile and evil he was. People pretended that he was. But the point was, you have to defend your support of him, right? You say, well, I actually don't like how rude he is. I'm from Minnesota. I want to say, well, gee golly, gosh, let's be all nice to each other, don't you know? But I'm willing to defend a brash New York billionaire who defends the life of the unborn over a polite guy from Delaware who spent time in Pennsylvania who defends the right to kill the unborn. That takes moral courage to be able to do. It's a lot easier to say, oh, I didn't vote for either. Right? That's a lot easier to do.
Yes, I agree.
And so I would say, if it is cowardice, it's that. It's you have to defend if it's a fight, and in a lot of ways, like, I agree with Piper's premise in that there's a whole paragraph in there that seemed totally out of place for the article. It was like, hey, a word to pastors: are you training people to be so strong of Christians that if tyranny does come, they'll still stand for their faith in the face of persecution? It's like, I was just like giving a bunch of amens in the middle of the article. It's like, and if you're not, are you allowing politics to distract you? Like, is this an article about politics distracting, or is it a political article about your stance?
Right?
Because it seemed completely out of place, but it was true. And I think, like, the way I look at this situation, I don't identify as a Republican or as a Trump supporter. I am a Christian, and I pray for the God's mercy on the nation, that His hand of judgment would be stayed, that there'd be moral awakening as a result of spiritual awakening and the gospel spreading in the country. And if God chooses to judge us, we deserve it, and He's righteous to do so. But the judgment that He would bring is over these issues. Killing of children is always a sign in the Old Testament of a nation under judgment, right? And there's no more clear promise of God, I will judge you, is the blessing or the cursing of Israel. I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. And so I see those two issues as very strongly linked. And so, like, no, I don't call myself a Trump supporter. But when you ask, who do you think would be, who ought to be president in 2016, it's like, oh, it would be nice if Ted Cruz was president. Well, Ted Cruz might get a nomination, but he will lose an election. In order to get somebody to actually be president, he has to be brash. He has to insult the unfair moderator or news person who's asking him an unfair question. George W. Bush will never get elected again. No one like him will ever get elected again unless there's the culture. And in our present culture, George W. Bush is unelectable.
I agree.
Right? And so if it's like, in 16, I was genuinely afraid of Trump. I had no idea who he was. He's a character on TV. Maybe he's a demagogue who's going to just be a tyrant. I was genuinely afraid. And I prayed, I can't pray that Hillary Clinton's president because I know she's a known commodity and she is enormously corrupt as well as supports all the immorality of this party. But Trump's an unknown commodity. Please, Lord, let it be somebody other than him. But when it was him and he started blessing Israel and started being more aggressive in getting the judiciary who cares about what the law says and are just judges as opposed to left-wing legislatures, like, holy smokes, the foolishness of God was wiser than men, and that's kind of how I viewed the 16 election. And so now going into this one, God, if you want to judge us, so be it. Your judgments are right. But my prayer is that we'd have a little more time.
And you continue to use this president to
right. And so I full-throatedly
right
say Trump is the better option for the United States for the continued blessing of the United States. And to say that is not to endorse Donald Trump as a man. And it's difficult. Like if I have neighbors who, if I ever put a Trump sign in my yard, would not talk to me ever again. So I don't have a Trump sign in my yard. But if the conversation comes up, I would have to make the difficulty of explaining what the issue is, that there is a God and he does rise up kings and cast them down and he does judge nations. And the current spiritual condition of the nation right now, I believe he put Trump there for our good so far. And that'd be a difficult thing to have to explain. And I think for someone like Piper to say brashness it's evil akin to child killing, and so I can't endorse either party. It's like that's not right, brother. I just think you're not right about that.
Well, that's actually interesting because I have noticed that with a lot of these, with a lot of the woke church movement, what a lot of the people who are part of that are saying, usually involves comparing the United States to Old Testament Israel. And it ends up bringing up the prophets and their condemnations of Israel. Jeremiah is appealed to a lot. Comparisons to King David are appealed to a lot. See, he had adultery that was the cause of the demise of Israel. What are your thoughts on that, given the fact that because we talked already a little bit about the theology that says we're just part of an empire, like America is Babylon essentially, and we're sojourning in it. That's not the same situation as ancient Israel, obviously. The kings that, if you're talking about kings of kings, like emperors that God raises up, they're not always great, even when they're blessing Israel. But when they bless Israel, God blesses them. Right.
Yeah. King Cyrus.
Plenty of them. Nebuchadnezzar, when he changes course, and others. That's the imperial look. You can see America as an empire. But the woke church seems to think of, no, America is Israel. Essentially, they're whether or not they're saying that explicitly, their moral condemnations of America rest on an assumption that the moral condemnations of Israel apply
right. So
to the United
when the
States.
prophet stands up and rebukes the nation of Israel, he's doing so with good authority. He's saying, "Thus saith the Lord," but he's also appealing to a law that God gave them. As God's people, here is your law, And here's where you're falling short. You're not caring for the sojourner. You are not caring for the poor. You are not taking care of your children or whatever. Or in Jeremiah's case, you're sacrificing your children to Molech, which I did not command, nor did it ever enter into my mind. It's one of my favorite condemnations. Like, I didn't even think of that one, you sickos.
And it seems like those are the ones we should avoid first. Before,
they're the fiercest. Like, woe unto you when they bash your children's head against the rocks.
And it seems like God is condemning the pagans as well when he makes those kinds of condemnations.
And that was a condemnation of Israel because of how wicked the pagans were. Like, you are my people who display, like Paul says in Romans 2, the name of God is blasphemed among the nations on your account.
And it almost seems like the woke church people or the woke...
They're treating America like Israel, as if they're a prophet.
Well, it's almost funny. They're kind of they're kind of Reaganites. They're thinking of the United States as we're a shining city on the hill, and if we're not...
It's not entirely unfair to do that, because America has a founding creed akin to, not identical to, but related in a similar way to the law of Moses that Israel could appeal to. You can appeal to the all men are created equal type founding documents of the United States and kind of as a prophet rebuke the state for...
Oh, yeah, which is basically what Martin Luther King was. He was an American prophet.
Exactly.
Someone appealing to the founding code. And so if you believe...
But what my point would be is you have to look, and it's like what we said before, Martin Luther King was fighting a battle related to the battle Abraham Lincoln was fighting. Mm-hmm. Entirely different than what George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were fighting, and entirely different than what today the godly, the righteous are fighting.
What you're saying today, then, hold on there, is that if we're going to talk about raising up prophets in an American context, instead of appealing to the Old Testament, we should be appealing to the founding creed of the United States.
Sort of, but what I'm saying is...
Lincoln was appealing to the idea of freedom in the same way that and appealing to the language, and so was Frederick Douglass appealing to the language of freedom that was in the original documents. Martin Luther King was appealing to the language of freedom that was in the original documents, even though he was also... But Martin Luther King also was
God is tied up with it from the beginning,
True, and God, even Lincoln's saying that God is judging us for the sin of slavery.
And so I'm actually saying it's okay to be the prophet, today. But what I'm saying, the point I'm making is the context that the prophet speaks to is hugely relevant, because there's
whether
one prophet...
Whether it's pagan or whether it's the people of God?
Because Jonah's message to Nineveh was the exact same...
Repent, yeah.
...as, in 2 Chronicles. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear and forgive their sins and heal their land. That's exactly what Jonah said to Nineveh.
Yeah.
You got 40 days, everybody. Repent, turn to God, and he'll heal you. Hope he doesn't. I hope you don't. I hope you're judged. In Jonah's case. But it was the exact same message. But the point is, Jeremiah told them, stay in Babylon. Seek the good of Babylon. You are here under God's judgment. This is God's doing. Totally different than what he would have said, like in Solomon's day, than what Elijah would have said. He would have said, Jerusalem is where the temple is. And you worship God in Jerusalem, and you don't. And the rebuke to every king was he didn't seek the face of the Lord the way his father David did, or he did seek the face of the Lord but he didn't take down the high places. They still worship wherever the heck they wanted instead of going back to Jerusalem. So you'd think going back to Jerusalem is the most important thing in the world. And it was with Zerubbabel. He's like, let's go back to Jerusalem. But in Jeremiah's day, they were under 70 years of captivity. They were told, don't go back, stay here. And the ones who went back were judged by God. So my whole point is, if you are preaching like you're Zerubbabel when it's the time of Jeremiah, or when you're preaching like Jeremiah when it's the time of Zerubbabel, you're actually opposing what the righteous are to be doing, what God's real call is. And that, I think, is the problem of fighting the 1960s civil rights movement when it's the life of the unborn that's really institutionally discriminated against. Right? And I think that's the problem. They're prophets, but they're not speaking to the actual what actually needs to be prophesied to and prophesied about. They're prophesying what's comfortable, which is what their grandparents fought for. A noble cause in its day, but it's actually deflecting from the real cause that the righteous are called to today.
I mean, I can get behind that, but do you want to tackle the tougher issue theologically of whether or not, like, America, do you treat America in the way that you treat, I mean, because you're saying Jeremiah's day is different from Solomon's day. Do we treat America like we're a people in exile in an empire, the way Jeremiah was, or do we treat America like we are part of a God-ordained nation that is Christian in some way, and therefore has a relationship with God where God is treating us the way he treated ancient Israel? Like when we have immoral leaders like David, that's
Nathan the prophet needs to stand up.
Yeah, we need the Nathans to go up there and tell Trump that was very bad of you to do that, and you're bringing judgments upon the United States in the same way that Israel, being a shining city on the hill, needed its leaders to be moral in the same way. Like,
so there's a couple questions there. How should the righteous view themselves? And obviously, aliens and sojourners is true. Mm-hmm. The citizens of another kingdom is true.
Well, I mean, you say that, but there are many in postmillennial Calvinist circles who would say that being citizens of another kingdom is a kingdom that we're supposed to be instantiating here.
Right. Yeah. This is just right now. It's just an outpost, but the goal is for it to take over. I don't hold that view eschatologically, but it's kind of like I view myself as a disciple of Jesus and a father to my children, and I have responsibilities for both. And the United States is not Israel. You know, we don't have the same ceremonial cleansing laws or any number of things like that. We don't have. It's a very different situation. But Israel was the shining city on a hill to display what it looks like for a nation to have God as Yahweh as their God, so that the other nations could do that. Like, that's why God held Nineveh to account when he sent his prophet to them. Mm-hmm. Right? Jonah was doing what the nation of Israel was called to do. That's the whole argument of Paul in the book of Romans. Is the condemnation of Israel. The condemnation of the Gentiles is a condemnation of Israel.
Okay.
And so we as a Gentile nation ought to have God as the Lord, ought to have Yahweh as our God, and ought to, like Nineveh, emulate Israel in her righteous obedience to the Lord when she was righteous in obedience to the Lord. A small fraction of her history, unfortunately. And so we should expect, when we're under judgment, for people to be killing their children.
Well, yeah.
And we should expect, when we bless the nation of Israel, when we care for the poor, when we honor our parents, that we might live long in the land, But when we are celebrating rebellion against parents, when we have no concern for the alien or sojourner among us, or when we have support the enemies of Israel seeking her destruction, we should expect judgment. And so it's kind of both things. As a disciple of Jesus, we are awaiting him to come and the rock from the mountain to crush the statue of the Gentile kingdoms and him to reign. And we're like, oh, our king is finally here. But we also have a sense in which we are a part of a Gentile nation that's to be, because there will be other nations. It's not just going to be Israel. Jesus is going to be king of Israel, but king of kings of the whole world. And there will be nations at that point who all emulate Jerusalem in having, Yahweh as their God.
So it's kind of, to come back full around to it, you kind of endorse Piper's view. It's not really that you're disagreeing with it so much. You're saying, yeah, we should, as America, be a shining city on a hill if we can, even though that was said by a divorcee who was moving our culture towards more lax sexual.
He was
morality.
A symptom more than a cause, I think. But.
Well, true, but we should care about that. But when you're dashing your kids against the rocks, let's start there.
Yeah, it looks like a nation under judgment. We should, like Franklin Graham says.
Here's where he'd come back to you, though. He'd be like, well, why are we doing that? Because we're a nation under judgment. And we're a nation under judgment because presumably guys like these evangelicals are voting for Trump.
But I would say that was where his contradiction was. He's saying, why do people abort children? Well, it's because of selfishness and sin, which is the same thing as boastfulness. And so Trump's sin is causing abortion. It's like, well, then you should really question whether Trump is the boastful, sinful, self-centered guy you think he is. Because why isn't it leading to... Why is Trump's character leading him to bless Israel and to defend the life of the unborn rather than curse Israel and kill the lives of the unborn? You know, if his character you're saying is what's causing the degradation, why isn't he in those so like what Piper's point is, both policies and character matter. Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Great. You know, both, that is true. But he also says character leads to policy. It's like, but if that's true, then we should see the character and the policy line up. And you're saying that they don't.
Or at least we should see the trajectory. And it seems like Trump's trajectory policy-wise
has been in the right direction.
Right.
So, and we don't know his heart. I don't know if he goes to these evangelical churches all the time just seeking votes. I'd imagine that's at least part of his motivation. But he does it more than Bush did. He does it way more than Obama did. Way more than Biden's doing. You know, I don't know any other president who lets a whole horde of Pentecostal Christians come and pray in tongues over him. He's either got a high tolerance for discomfort, or he thinks maybe there's some truth to it that he acknowledges. And really, that's all God required of King Cyrus was, okay, go worship your God. You know, some acknowledgement of the...
Yeah, and that's kind of where it's at, because we keep kind of going back and forth between seeing the United States as the empire, which you're only expecting of King Cyrus, and seeing it as aspiring to be at least one of those Gentile nations that Christ becomes the ruler of in the end times. And maybe that means Abraham Lincoln was right. We're kind of an almost we're an almost chosen people. Chosen. We're like,
I like our goal is to be the repentant king of Nineveh. We'll settle for King Cyrus at the moment. So long
while
as
we're under judgment.
So long as we don't have the ones who are saying.
Well, that's actually an interesting point. Maybe it's when you're under judgment. That's when the theology of empire becomes more relevant, because you're dealing with dashing of the kids against them. Yeah,
and the only thing the main point is, say the ones who are offering their kids to Molech, that's the bridge too far. That's where you have to draw the line.